Welcome to day 3 devotion. We are going to be in Luke chapter 9 this morning. So if you want to go ahead and turn your Bible, get your Bibles, run, go grab them real quick, go get your Bibles, open it up, go to Luke, go to chapter 9. That's where we're going to be for our devotion this morning. We're going to talk about where Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. The reason why we're going to be doing this is because I feel like God has led me to these verses to share with you guys something like really, really awesome, and give you all some good information as well. So we're going to be in Luke 9. We're going to be in verses 18 through 22. So it's only 4 verses. I want to also remind you guys that tomorrow at 1 p.m. we'll be doing our surviving quarantine check-in. So, we'll be I'll be calling you guys on Google Hangouts or Zoom, and we will be checking in with you guys, making sure y'all are all good. And that everything's okay. See what y'all have planned for the weekend, and if y'all have any prayer requests, you can let us know. Of course, you can let us know anytime. Hope you guys enjoyed the Bible study last night. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, Luke chapter 9, verse 18 says, "Now it happened that he was praying alone, and the disciples were with him. And he asked them, 'Who do the crowd say that I am?' And they answered, 'John the Baptist. But others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has risen.' Then he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Peter answered, 'The Christ of God.' And he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, 'The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised.'" So let's set the scene. So it starts off, it says, "Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him." Now this seems kind of contradictory if we first look at it, but we can see it as Jesus was praying and the disciples came to join him. We don't know if they joined him in prayer or if they just interrupted his time, like, "Hey Jesus, we have this question," or if they just were like coming in, like they had just finished lunch or something maybe, and Jesus was praying and they came walking in and Jesus was praying and they were just being loud, and Jesus was like, "Well, okay." But when he was done praying, Jesus asked them, "Who do the crowd say that I am? Who do people say that I am?" And it's not like he asked this question because he was ignorant or because he needed knowledge into what others were saying about him, but he asked this because he was going to ask a more important follow-up question. And so they answered, "John the Baptist. Some say Elijah. Others say the prophets of old." And so people thought that Jesus was John the Baptist. And people who thought that, they didn't know much about Jesus, because we know that he and John both worked at the same time. They were actually even cousins. Like, we know that that's obviously not what it could have been. And others also say Elijah, and they bring up John the Baptist and Elijah because these were both national reformers. They stood against corrupt rulers of their day, and they had this like similarity of courage and righteousness that Jesus had. It was a very strong connection. And then some of them say, and the disciples also go on to say that one of the prophets of old has risen. They could have been thinking Jeremiah, Isaiah, any one of those. And so, again, like, what we get from these answers from people of John the Baptist and Elijah, what we see is that most of what the people wanted at that time was a political Messiah, a very earthly ruler, a very earthly king. And so then Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God." Now this is one of those times where Peter's like on it, and Peter says, "The Christ of God." Now, what we have to remember is that Christ was not Jesus' last name. It wasn't. Christ is actually a word that means anointed one. So when Peter says the Christ of God, he says the anointed one of God. And it's another way of saying the Messiah. And so Peter knew Jesus better than the crowds did. He knew that Jesus is the Christ of God, God's Messiah, the promised Redeemer from the Old Testament, and not the desire of man, not the Messiah from the desire of man, but the Messiah from the heart of God. Does that make sense? It wasn't the Messiah from the desire of man, but from God's heart. And then we see that Jesus strictly warns them to tell no one. He commands them to tell no one. He didn't want his identity popularly known before it was the right time. One commentator says that before they could preach that Jesus was the Messiah, they had to learn what that meant. And so he goes on to say, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised again." After hearing what the crowds thought of him, Jesus then told his disciples what he was going to be doing, what he had really come to do. He had really come to suffer, be rejected, and die and be raised again. We see as we go through like the whole time, like leading up to Jesus' death and his crucifixion, that it is not what the disciples wanted. Peter, in an effort to defend Jesus, pulls out his sword and cuts off the ear of a guy, and Jesus is like, "Dude, chill." And Jesus also says the Son of Man must suffer many things. The word "must" here is very important. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't an idea. It wasn't even a prediction. This was the fulfillment of what was planned before. Way back in Genesis chapter 3, where God hands down his curses, he also hands down a promise of a Messiah. And he tells the serpent, there will be enmity between you and the woman's offspring, and you shall bruise his heel, but he shall bruise your head. And the serpent being representative of sin, death, and just our whole falling short as humanity, and Jesus being the offspring of Eve, and being the offspring of being that born into perfection, and that's what that idea means. Not that Jesus is the literal offspring of Eve, but when God is talking about the offspring of Eve, he's talking about like this figurative, like Jesus will be born into perfection just as Adam and Eve were, and Jesus will be what man was supposed to be. This is why we say that Jesus is 100% man, but 100% God also. And so he promises the Messiah in Genesis chapter 3 by saying, yes, you're going to strike a fatal blow. Satan's going to strike a fatal blow against him, but it's not going to last. And death, sin, that stuff that separates us from God will be fully defeated. And that's what happened on Easter. On Sunday, we're going to celebrate Easter, and that's what happened, where death was defeated because Jesus rose again on the third day. So we see that Jesus tells his disciples in this moment that it was a must for him to rise. It was a must for him to rise. It was important. It needed to be done in order to fulfill what was planned before. The resurrection was a must. As any other aspect of his suffering, Jesus had to rise from the dead. And so we see that this morning that the disciples are asked, "Who do you say that I am? Or who do people say that I am?" And in this time, I want you guys to reflect on that question also. Reflect on the fact that Jesus said that he had to die and be raised again, suffer, be rejected. All this stuff had to happen. And all this stuff did happen. And in it, he fulfilled the prophecy. He fulfilled what was laid out before. And so now, guys, I want y'all to get this morning. What I want y'all to get from this morning is I want y'all to understand that when we read these verses, guys, we know that Jesus is the Christ of God, the anointed one of God. We know that he had to die and he had to be raised in order to save us from our sins. And so now it's our job to go out and share that. It's our job to go out and spread that. I hope you guys have a good time in quarantine this morning, and I will see you guys tomorrow, 1 o'clock.